Okay, so we're really digging in deep today, like seriously deep into military theory. We're talking Clausewitz, Book 3, chapters 13, 14, and 15.
Mhm.
Strategic reserves, economy of force, all that good stuff. Now, I know you live and breathe this stuff, but even seasoned vets can find something insightful in Clausewitz. It's like a fresh perspective on familiar terrain.
Absolutely. Clausewitz is one of those thinkers, you know?
Mhm.
His ideas are still relevant even centuries later. He makes you think critically about how you deploy forces, how you manage them, even today.
Right off the bat, Clausewitz dives into strategic reserves, and he really makes a clear distinction between tactical and strategic reserves.
Yeah.
Tactical reserves are for, as he puts it, prolonging and renewing combat. Basically, your reinforcements during a battle.
Right, exactly. He's drawing a line between what you need right then and there in the battle versus what you're holding back for the bigger picture. The strategic reserve, that's those forces you keep in your back pocket just in case some unforeseen event pops up on a larger scale.
So it's like having a plan B, or a plan C even, tucked away for when things go sideways.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Clausewitz argues that as your scope of operations expands, the need for a strategic reserve actually shrinks.
That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, wouldn't a larger operation require more backup just in case?
You would think so, right? But Clausewitz, he argues that on that grand strategic scale, you need to fully commit to the main objective. Holding back too much when the stakes are that high, it can backfire. He actually calls this commitment to course of action the supreme decision. And once that supreme decision is made, it's all in. Everything is geared towards achieving that objective, reserves or no reserves.
So sometimes going all in is the more strategic option.
Yeah, within that framework of the supreme decision, absolutely.
Okay.
And this ties into another one of his big concepts, the economy of force. Clausewitz stresses that keeping forces idle is a strategic blunder.
Makes sense.
Every unit, every soldier, it all represents potential.
It's like that saying, an unused resource is a wasted resource.
Yeah, more than that even. He compares inactive troops to troops on the march. Essentially, they're dead from a strategic standpoint. Powerful image, isn't it?
It is.
It drives home the point that even when troops aren't directly fighting, they can still contribute to the overall war effort.
Okay, so we've got these strategic reserves, the importance of keeping our forces active, engaged. Where does the geometry part come into all this? War, I mean, it's unpredictable, it's messy, it's not exactly a game of chess.
That's a great point. And Clausewitz, he acknowledged that. He doesn't discount the value of tactical maneuvering, you know, flanking, encirclements, the kind of things you'd plot out on a map.
So he sees the value of geometry and tactics.
He does, but he's wary of relying too heavily on what he calls the geometrical element, especially when you're talking about strategy. On a strategic level, there are just too many variables, too many unknowns to rely solely on clever maneuvers.
Because the enemy gets a vote. Right, they can react in ways you might not expect.
Yeah. Exactly. They're not just going to sit there and let you outmaneuver them. Plus, you're talking about strategy now. That scale of operations is way bigger, way more fluid. A strategic plan that depends on perfect geometrical positioning. It's going to fall apart.
So if we can't get too hung up on the geometry, how does Clausewitz suggest we approach strategy?
Well, he emphasizes winning those individual battles, of course. But it's more than that. You got to maintain the initiative, and adapt constantly to how the situation is changing. Because war, it never goes exactly how you plan it.
Yeah.
He's saying that war, it's about a lot more than just lines on a map.
It's that whole fog of war thing.
Exactly. It's applying force, yeah, but it's also the morale of your troops, the logistics of it all, and having to change your plans constantly based on what the enemy is doing. It's about recognizing that war, it's a human endeavor at its core. You can't forget that.
Makes me think about how even today, with all the technology and intel gathering we have, you still can't predict everything. There are always those moments, those unforeseen events where you just have to adapt on the fly. How does that fit in with what Clausewitz is saying?
That's where his emphasis on adaptability comes in. He argues that the best way to handle the unexpected isn't trying to predict every single possibility because you can't. It's about having that mindset of flexibility, of being able to roll with the punches.
So instead of being glued to this rigid plan, you need to be able to think on your feet.
Exactly. It's about, really deeply understanding the context, like what's motivating each side, what are the ripple effects, if we do this or that. It's about constantly reassessing, questioning your assumptions, being willing to shift gears based on new intel.
So agility, right, both mentally and operationally.
Yeah, you could say that. And you know, it's interesting. Clausewitz, he was writing back in the 19th century, right? But those ideas about strategic reserves, economy of force, they're still relevant,
Yeah.
even with the kind of warfare we see today.
Absolutely. I mean, the tools of warfare have evolved, but the core principles, they still hold true, don't they?
Hmm.
But how do we apply these concepts to things beyond just, troops on a battlefield?
Okay, so think of it like this. Let's say you're planning a large-scale operation. Your intel assets, your secure comms, those are your strategic reserves.
It's like instead of a reserve battalion ready to deploy, it's having that crucial piece of intel, that secure line of communication that can make all the difference.
Exactly. And just like Clausewitz warned about letting troops sit idle, the same applies to these resources, right? If you're not out there gathering intelligence, analyzing data, strengthening those communication networks, you lose your edge.
They become like those troops on the march he talked about, strategically irrelevant when you need them most.
Precisely. It's about being proactive, vigilant, always looking for ways to maximize the effectiveness of every single asset you have at your disposal. And, that kind of brings us back to Clausewitz's emphasis on the human element in war.
Because even in our tech-driven world, war still comes down to people at the end of the day.
Absolutely. You can have the most cutting-edge weapons, the most detailed battle plans, but if your troops aren't disciplined, if they're not motivated, if they don't have good leadership, it's all for nothing. You got to invest in training, in fostering adaptability, initiative, that ability to make sound judgment when the pressure's on.
Clausewitz also argued that the need for a strategic reserve, it actually decreases as the operation gets bigger. He seems to be suggesting that sometimes you just got to commit everything to the main effort.
He did, especially when the stakes are incredibly high, like when the fate of a nation is on the line, You can't afford to hesitate. You have to be bold, decisive, willing to put it all on the line.
But how do you balance that with economizing force? It seems like we're talking about two opposite things.
It's a delicate balance, no question. But understanding the context is key. When Clausewitz talked about economy of force, he wasn't advocating for being timid or holding back for no reason. He was talking about maximizing the impact of every action, every single resource you use.
So it's not about just hoarding resources, it's about using them strategically, being efficient and effective.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that every soldier, every bullet, every gallon of fuel, it's all finite. You need to be smart about it, effective. And sometimes that means going all in, even if there's risk involved.
So with all that said, how do Clausewitz's ideas hold up in the face of modern warfare? I mean, we're talking about rapid deployments, precision strikes, this global interconnectedness. The battlefield, it's a lot different than it was back in the 19th century.
It is. And that's what's so fascinating about Clausewitz. On the one hand, you could argue that modern warfare, how fast it moves, it makes those large static reserves almost obsolete.
Because you can deploy troops and launch strikes anywhere in the world so quickly.
Right. And technology, it's amazing, right? We can accomplish so much more with fewer resources. Think about it. One drone strike can achieve what it might have taken an entire battalion to do in Clausewitz's time. So technology, in a way, it's amplified our ability to economize force.
But you're saying even with all that, Clausewitz is still relevant.
Oh, absolutely. Because while technology might have changed things in terms of speed and firepower, those fundamental principles, they're still the same. Why? Because war, it's still a human endeavor at its heart.
It still boils down to leadership, to morale, the ability to make decisions and adjust to unexpected challenges, no matter how much technology has evolved.
Exactly. And that's why you still see Clausewitz studied in military academies today. His ideas, they provide this framework for understanding conflict, regardless of the tech or tactics involved. He makes you ask those essential questions, Like, what's the nature of this conflict? What are our goals? And how can we best use everything we've got to achieve them?
It's amazing, isn't it, how these ideas that Clausewitz wrote centuries ago, they still resonate today in the military.
Yeah. Well, he gives us this framework, right, for understanding conflict. It's bigger than just tactics or which tech you have.
He talks a lot about the culminating point of victory. This idea that there's a point where even if you push further, you're actually hurting your own cause.
Yeah, that's huge. Especially if you're in a command role, you got to get that.
Wow.
It all ties back to his economy of force concept. Even when you're winning, you can still overextend, right? Your resources, your reach. It's about knowing when you've accomplished the mission, knowing when it's time to consolidate rather than keep pushing.
That's really interesting because it kind of goes against that whole idea of always pressing the attack.
It does. But Clausewitz, He understood how unpredictable war is. The longer it drags on, the more factors get thrown in. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Things you didn't see coming, alliances shifting, even just your own troops getting worn down. Knowing when to hit pause, regroup, consolidate, that can be just as important as knowing when to attack.
So, strategic foresight. Understanding how what you do now, it doesn't just impact this one battle, but the whole war.
Absolutely. There's this one part where Clausewitz compares the effects of winning tactically versus strategically. He says, in tactics, the last act is the most important.
Because in a battle, it comes down to who lands that final blow.
Right. But then he says, when it comes to strategy, the first act is the most important.
So those early victories, they set the tone for everything that comes after.
Exactly. They shape how people perceive the conflict, who allies with who, what resources are available. It's like setting the stage, you know?
It's about momentum, seizing the initiative right from the start and putting the other side on their heels.
Exactly. And that's why Clausewitz, he's so big on the psychological side of warfare, you know? It's not just about winning battles, it's about winning the narrative, at home and on the world stage. You got to get how your actions are being perceived and how that can actually change the course of things.
It really makes you think about what victory even means in war, doesn't it?
It's more complicated than just taking territory or inflicting casualties. It's about achieving your goals, yeah, but also understanding what it might cost, what the consequences might be down the line.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive here into Clausewitz, what would you say is the one big takeaway you want listeners to remember?
Remember that Clausewitz, he wasn't just talking about how to fight wars. He was talking about conflict itself. What he says about strategy, about leadership, about the human side of it all, it's still relevant, even now, 200 years later. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and don't forget, the human element, it's always a factor in any conflict.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your insights. Hopefully our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of Clausewitz and how his ideas are still relevant even today.
My pleasure. And hey, one last thing from the man himself, something to think about. War is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty.
Words to live by. Or maybe words to avoid war by. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.